Hello and welcome to this episode of FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my guest is Helen Scott. How are you, Helen?
I'm really good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. A busy day, but made it onto the podcast. For the audience, I was a little late. Not that it actually matters for the audience because it's pre-recorded, but I was a little late, due to prior meetings. But made it in the end, and now we're here with Helen. So, do you want to introduce yourself and what you do? Because you work at JetBrains, and what you do
Okay.
there.
Sure. As you've already said, my name's Helen Scott. I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains. In terms of what I do there, I always try and come up with a good answer to this question, and I pretty much fail every time. No week is the same. No day is the same. I do lots of things, including providing product feedback, liaising with developers, trying out the product, of course, lots of EAPs and dog fooding, creating content, going to conferences, and I love it. I've been doing it nearly 3 years now. So, in a nutshell, a little bit of everything.
Okay. So a developer advocate, that's probably a role that many people in the audience haven't heard of. They've heard of programmers, they've heard of designers, they might have heard of, UI and UX designers or, platform engineers, for example. But developer advocate, they generally don't hear of. Like, how do you go about getting into that field? And like, obviously you've explained what you do within that field, but like,
Yeah.
what's like, if you was to see a posting for a job as a developer advocate, what would it actually say, your day-to-day responsibilities and requirements would be?
It's a great question, and I'm gonna go with the cop out answer of it depends because it really does. In my experience, a lot of, and it's not just in developer advocacy; it's in a lot of roles within our industry. They mean different things in different places. Product owner, for example, can mean different things in different places. Developer advocate can mean different things in different places. But fundamentally, most developer advocates or developer advocates roles, at least the ones that I've seen, I've only ever done it in one place, of course, but the roles that I've seen are usually a mix of working with the community in whatever form that may take. So that may take the form of conferences, blog posts, video creation, all the socials. Also, it doesn't have to come through a social media channel. It can be any channel, working with the community. It's that combined with lots of product feedback. So we're very big on at JetBrains is dog fooding. So trying out our stuff before it goes out there and saying this works, this doesn't work, this is going to be a problem, the community want this, and being that point of liaison as well. And then, so yeah, what have I covered? I've covered working with the community. I've covered working with the product, and then your own ideas as well, right? Sprinkling those throughout because you have experience, you have ideas, you hear kind of noise on the grapevine, what people are looking for, what people want, and you can feed all that back in because ultimately our job is to help developers, right? That's our kind of bread and butter, is if we can find a way to help developers do what they do and be even more awesome than they already are, then that's great advocacy.
Okay, so you've got a computer science degree, a programming degree. How important is a programming typical developer background to being a developer advocate?
Oh, developer advocates come from all walks of life. They really do. And I think it's wonderful because developers come from all walks of life. And if you're going to advocate for developers, then I think it's really important that you have representation from all the different walks of life that they come from as well. So, you know, my computer science degree was very helpful. It gave me a solid grounding in a bunch of principles that I still use today. Let's call out algorithms. Who doesn't love a good algorithm? But it's not the only route into development. Of course, it's not. There's, you can teach yourself. It's awesome. There's boot camps, there's apprenticeships, there's degrees, there's everything in between. And they're all perfectly valid and fantastic ways to, become a developer, become a developer advocate. Also, my background's largely in technical writing, which is more skewed on the content creation side of things, but it's still working with developers and it's still kind of advocating for developers. It's just advocating in a different way. So, in terms of your question, is a degree important? No, not in my opinion. Mine's great, but that we all have different desires and come from very different areas. So I think that's phenomenal because it brings a real diversification into the industry, and developer advocacy is no different in that respect. So yeah.
Okay, you touched on a good point that in the modern world, there's so many ways of, let's say, if you was to become a normal programmer, developer, you can obviously go down the university degree route. You can, there's YouTube, there's boot camps, there's crash courses, there's books as well, and there's, podcasts, can, aid that. I don't think they're really a substitute to a programming book, at least not right now, or some sort of YouTube course, but they can they can definitely aid your journey. So yeah, I agree that a computer science degree isn't crucial, whether that's being a developer advocate or a developer in general. But what about having a technical programming developer background for being a developer advocate?
You will find that most developer advocates do have that in some form, myself included. Um, that said, I don't think I wouldn't say that's even a blocker in itself. Developer advocates really do come from all walks of life, and because of the range of the job, that does support being able to come in from really quite a unique angle. So is it a hard requirement? I would say it's a usual requirement. I wouldn't like to say it's a hard requirement because I think we can all bring different strengths. And when you've got a role as varied as advocacy, there are a lot of different threads to that. Content creation, working with developers. Some people are amazing at learning very quickly to whatever they need to learn to the right level, to the right depth and the right amount, and then being able to take that information with very little perhaps developer experience in quotes, and take that information and use it to help other developers in a similar situation. Some people are very gifted in that respect and they can do that, whereas other people have, I don't know, let's say at the other end of the spectrum, 15, 20 years experience coding, and they come to developer advocacy with that wealth of experience, which gives them a unique and different angle. So yeah, it really is very varied.
Okay, one thing I'm interested to hear about is where in the hierarchy does a developer advocate's salary, sit? Because let's say if you got regular developers within there, you got juniors, mid, senior, lead, all of that. Above that, generally speaking, is the management level. Above that will be the C-suite, the CEO, COOs, etc. And potentially above that, depending on the size of the company and the type of company, will be like board, huge board members. Where is a developer advocate sitting in terms of salary, generally speaking?
I would say the best way to find that information out is to check out the surveys that the tech industry put out. So the two that immediately come to mind are the Stack Overflow and the JetBrains ecosystem survey. Both of those, I would say, would be useful source of information, as well as just the general. It sounds a bit, cliche to say Google it, but my experience in this area won't be that useful for the listeners because I am one. So I would say, yeah, have a look at surveys, because again, it's going to vary quite wildly in different companies. So that would be my advice there.
Yeah, okay. I think that's fair enough. And as a developer advocate, how do you bridge the gap between the technical side, so the
Mhm.
developers, for example, and the non-technical side, end users, stakeholders, that sort of stuff? Because you do have the advantage of having the technical background, but like, how do you
Yeah.
personally bridge the gap between the two?
Um, The good news is you don't really have to, because as a developer advocate, you're working with developers internally and you're working with developers externally. I try not to put, I try not to use the boxes technical and non-technical, because I think fundamentally everybody is on a range somewhere of the skills that they possess. And I think if we start saying technical and non-technical, we can potentially alienate people. So for me, it's a case of everybody's an individual and understanding where they are at on their journey, what skills they have, what skills they're trying to learn, and what their struggles are as well. So when it comes to bridging the gap, it's just a case of understanding what their needs are, and understanding what the needs of their users are, understanding their workflows, understanding if they've got any struggles, can you help, and empowering them that way rather than trying to bridge a gap, so to speak.
Okay, fair enough. So JetBrains, it's a huge company. They've got a lot of products. So which particular products have you worked on and do you work on as a developer advocate? Or is it more literally just everything that JetBrains does?
It's not everything. There's not enough hours in the
I
day.
know
Um,
when you have a look, like JetBrains is one of those companies that uh, I feel like non-technical people that aren't in the industry at all, unlikely to have heard of, and then people that are within the industries, programmers, or the ones that interact with programs like recruiters, designers, they will have probably heard of one or two products, but when you look, there's just so many things they do.
yeah, I mean, for me, I spent a couple of years focusing on IntelliJ IDEA. I've recently started focusing on PyCharm because I've been interested in Python for quite a while now, and I wanted to learn some. I mean, one of the great things that I think, well, many great things, but about the JetBrains products is we have the platform, which is why if you've been using, say, IntelliJ IDEA, you can use PyCharm because it's the same interface, it's the same shortcuts, within reason. One is Java and one is Python, but it's the same base functionality in that respect. So it lowers the barriers between moving between different IDEs in that way, even though it's with different technology. A lot of the functionality will be familiar to developers if they switch between our IDEs. So yeah, does that answer your question?
So, can you share an example of a project that you worked on, but you wasn't 100% sure how to, interact with the developers or advocate for it, and how did you overcome that?
um I think so. A lot of our work that we do as developer advocates is quite it's not really big bang. It's more of a slow burn. So we generally iterate over weeks and months when it comes to new things. I've already mentioned dog fooding. That's something that we do for a new feature or a way of working. And first and foremost, it's just a case of, like I've already said, seeking to understand, understand what the user needs to do, what their workflow might be, being that conduit. In terms of advocating, there's loads of little examples, but it's just a case of listening, taking that information back, and trying to do something helpful with it that's going to empower the developer. It's most developer advocacy work isn't big bang. It's more of an ongoing thread that every day we just strive to do better and to meet the needs of our users.
Okay, so in this pursuit, when you're getting feedback, let's say from external developers, for example, or even internal developers, how do you use that feedback to help shape the JetBrain products?
How do we use it? we
Yeah.
we listen to it first and foremost, and we take it back to the product teams, we discuss, we find out more information, and then we iterate. That's what it's all about. It's not just a case of putting something out there and then ignoring. It's a case of dog feeding it internally initially, seeing what works, what doesn't. Then it goes through a series of EAP, so early access programs, to find out, does it work? have we hit the mark? Have we not hit the mark? And getting the feedback that way. So it's just a case of constant iteration.
So how do you stay updated, with the latest industry trends, technologies, languages, etc.? Because obviously, as part of your job, I'm sure it's important for you to know what's coming up, what other
Yeah.
companies are doing, etc.
Um, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. I think this is a challenge at any job, whether you're a developer advocate, a developer, or a product owner, anything, because your time always gets super squeezed, and it's impossible to keep up with every single trend or new thing. It's just not feasible. There aren't enough hours in the day. There are a few techniques that I use depending on how I feel. I prefer reading to watching videos, but I know many of your listeners will probably prefer videos.
Yeah.
But it's just finding a medium that works for you and fitting that around your schedule and life in general. Maybe there's a little bit of downtime in the afternoon, kind of, if you don't work with America anyway, there might be a little bit of downtime in the afternoon. Maybe you can schedule just half an hour then to read a blog or watch a video. But it is hard because you're often dodging meetings and other commitments and deadlines. So it's finding a medium that works for you, whether that's videos, blog posts, or something else. Trying to carve out some time in your schedule that won't be overwritten or overscheduled, and then making the time, because time is all we have, and we really have to make that time to stay on top, and also not go too deep into the rabbit hole unless it is required for our job. And for a lot of developers it will be. We do have to go deep into the rabbit hole, but not always. Conferences as well, if you can get to attend conferences, they're a great way of finding out kind of what's hot, what's coming, and getting maybe there's a new, I don't know, front end framework for JavaScript, and you need just a quick TLDR. A conference can be a really nice way of achieving that, for example.
Okay. And as a developer advocate, like, how do you measure success? Because, as a programmer, ideally when you have like a work item, you'll have acceptance criteria and you can, measure it against that. But what does a developer advocate measure their success by?
This is a time-honored question. There are various metrics, of course there are, but for me, I think you need to take quite a holistic viewpoint, and I'll tell you why. It's because, say you put a blog post out there and you look at it and you say, great, that blog post got 2,000 more views than this other blog post. But what does that really mean? Does that mean that the blog post that you wrote was better than the other blog post? Does it mean that you posted on a Monday, whereas the other blog post was posted on a Saturday, and nobody reads technical blog posts on a Saturday? Does it mean that what you wrote about was more interesting than the other blog post? You don't know. All you can do is make a hypothesis that you can subsequently test, or many hypotheses that you can subsequently test. So metrics are great and powerful, but I think they need to be used in conjunction with meaningful hypotheses and tested. I'm not saying don't measure, absolutely do measure. I'm just saying measure and don't get caught up in what you think might be the reason for something's success, or equally something's failed. You might put a video out and it gets let's say it gets 100 views, and most videos on the channel get 30,000 views, and you think, well, why is that video done so badly? Again, you don't know, but you can measure it, you can form a hypothesis, and then just know why you're doing something as well. That I think is helpful for measuring success, because if you know why you're doing it, say there's a particular pain point in the product, if you know why you're doing it and you can then measure the success, that can help to form a picture that you can then use to say, okay, this worked, this didn't work, and this might be the reason. There's no magic answer to this one, in my opinion. I think measuring is very, very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. So how important is storytelling, in your role as a developer advocate, and how do you use it effectively?
Well, humans thrive on stories. They really do thrive on stories. We, we're raised on bedtime stories, and our brains really do light up when when we hear a story. And developer advocacy and any content creation, this side of developer advocacy is no different. So I think it's extremely important. And if you can tell a story and your audience, whether that's a video, blog post, or whatever, your audience can identify with that story and they can partake in it, then they are far more likely to engage, to enjoy it, to learn from it, to stick around. There is an element sometimes that in certainly developer advocacy you might produce more of a marketing type video. Again, this is everywhere on the developer advocacy spectrum. It's a big range. But if it's a more marketing video, then maybe there wouldn't be so much story. It might just be bang, 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 feature, feature, feature. But normally for a developer advocacy video where you are imparting knowledge or showing the developer community how to do something that you believe will help them, then telling them a story, making it cohesive, making it fun, adding a bit of infotainment can be really valuable, because this industry moves crazy fast and you have to respect people's time. So if a developer has carved out half an hour on that Wednesday afternoon to check out the latest trends and do their learning, then you need to be aware of that and cognizant of their time and their gift to you, and that they're giving you their time. So it's a case of tell them a story, make it informative, and see what they can then go and do with it. Because the bottom line is you're there to empower them. You're not there to produce an amazing video with all the with all the whistles. You're just there to tell them a story and empower them to be awesome at their job. So I would say it's very important. Humans thrive on stories.
Yeah, I totally agree. Having a good story can, you know, take you from shutting out, just zoning out after a minute or two, to just listening for hours and hours. So having
Yeah.
some good, why, how, what's instead of just what's happening,
Yeah.
having some sort of story to, really engage you, can really help.
Yeah, definitely.
So can you share any experiences where you had to pitch, some sort of unconventional idea, let's say based on feedback, and how did you, get your stakeholders to, buy in on, the idea?
Um, so unconventional idea, the one that comes to mind first is not from developer advocacy, but I think it's relevant. It's from the technical writing world. The unconventional idea was when I was working in a developer, in a developer team covering multiple developer teams that all came together to produce one product. And the feedback that we kept getting was that the sales team specifically did not know what was coming from development. So kind of to them, development was a black box. They couldn't see what was coming. Um, and the unconventional idea that I had, and I, in the end managed to implement, was just a little web server. It was that simple. And what I said to them was, I will spin you up a little web server and it will be internal only. And every night I will publish the documentation that I am writing to that server. Here is the IP address, help yourself. And I said 70% of it will be correct and 30% of it will not be correct. It will have errors, it will have typos, it will be clumsily written, but it will be there and you will be able to see what is coming up at a level in the product that wasn't available in the kind of high level, here's what we're going to release in the next iteration of the product. And there was a lot of kind of not a lot, a little bit of pushback to the idea, because they felt like that wouldn't solve it, and how would they know which 70% was correct and which 30% wasn't? I said, well, respectfully, this is the best that I can offer. And the whole goal here was to make the development team a little less of a black box to other areas of the business. And I implemented the web server and I did what I'd said I was going to do. I published there every evening. And of course, some of the stuff was incorrect because what goes into a release bends and flexes, as we all know, depending on what kind of way of working you're using. But ultimately, everything that was committed to a release, I don't know, 2 months before the release, rarely makes it for whatever reason. So some features did get cut, but the sales team absolutely loved it because they could see what was coming. They had an inkling when they were speaking to their customers of whether or not something was going to be added to the product or changed or fixed. And it made everybody really, really happy in the end. So that was a big success for me.
Okay. So, when you get feedback, like feedback's not always going to be either positive or, just something that you can easily not ignore and not act on, but not take, personally. Like, how do you handle negative feedback, or criticism from the developer community?
Same way you handle any feedback. I mean, feedback is a gift. It's somebody saying, this isn't working for me. What can you do? And ultimately, if somebody's giving you negative feedback, there's a really good chance that they're frustrated, that something hasn't worked. No product is perfect, something hasn't worked. So you can then use that, you can open the channels of communication and learn more. We all want to be heard. We want to be listened to. We want to be understood. That's a very human need. So, if you can seek to understand their point of view, their challenges, acknowledge the pain point, because regardless of whether it exists or whether they're doing something or they're trying to do something that isn't in the product, or it is in the product but they don't know how to do it, the fact is that it's a pain point for them right there and then. So acknowledge it and then do your level best to fix it for them. So it really is seeking to understand, because we are all human and we all want to be heard.
I think that's fair enough. So, can you talk about a recent initiative or project that you worked on that you're particularly proud of?
Ooh, I would say recently. What are we defining as recently? I would say the JetBrains guide, specifically the IntelliJ Idea guide. So we have a series of guides. We have one per product at the moment, but we're looking at making some changes there. But the IntelliJ Idea guide was my project. So that's something that I created and I added a load of content to. And going back to your question about how do you measure success, you measure it, but measurements only give you part of the story. And I can make a hypothesis from the number of views that I see it gets that developers are finding it useful. There was one mortifying moment a few months ago where I Googled something because I'd forgotten how to do it. And then I saw a video from myself on the IntelliJ Idea Guide. So for me, that was a big success because I took it from nothing to what I believe and hypothesize is a helpful repository of tips and tricks for IntelliJ Idea. And I still, I add to it, I update it, I add new tutorials to it as and when I've got the time. So that's something I am really proud of, is that project.
So documentation, like the guide stuff is something I feel like a lot of developers, a lot of companies, do, fall flat on their face on. They, focus so much on the product, the service, and again, it's like commenting code as well. Like it's one of those things that it's almost like an afterthought. Like what advice would you give or tips and tricks to not only create good documentation, but to do it in a way that you're doing it as you're going along, or that you're making sure that it's getting done instead of having, let's say, 20 new code files created, components, for example, but they're not documented yet.
Good question. I think, well, there are lots of answers to this question. I would say definitely there are some guiding principles that you can use. Firstly, everyone can write. Doesn't matter, what your team structure is. Everybody can write, and whatever form that writing takes can be helpful. If you answer the question from a technical writer point of view, I would give advice such as be integrated into the team as much as you can be. The technical writer time will always get squeezed, so be in there. Understand people. Get the information out of the developers' heads, because the last person a developer probably wants to see 12 hours before the release is the technical writer asking them about a feature. So go to the stand-ups, find out how the release is looking, download the nightly builds, or whatever. If you've got continuous integration, great. Get on there, start using the product, test it. You're a tester as much as anything else when you're doing documentation. So test it, click things, break things, understand how it works, and then get it documented. Even if it changes, you've got something written down, and something is a lot better than nothing. In terms of, if you're not coming at it from a technical writer point of view, I would say try different ways. Try different ways of working. Yes, everybody can write. Not everybody likes to write. Maybe there's some people in the team who prefer writing over other people in the team. Maybe they'd like to take a little bit of a lead in terms of creating the documentation. Maybe the team want to create the documentation. Maybe they want to use a wiki. This podcast would not be long enough to go into the pros and cons of a wiki, but for example, that's one option. Maybe they are moving more towards a model where all the documentation will be in the code base and stored alongside the code. Again, there's a whole bunch of pros and cons and ways of working associated with that one. But I would say everyone can write. Some people like writing more than others. Some people really like it, like myself. Little and often, try things out. And the fun thing about technical writing and documentation in general is you rarely get feedback on it unless it's wrong. If it's wrong, you'll know about it. But if it's not wrong, I always kind of fall back on a kind of saying that I've acquired over the years of technical writing, is that if a user is reading your documentation, they are probably, or at least potentially, maybe already annoyed. Because, when you get a new phone, or you get a new TV and you have to tune it for channels, that's probably showing my age, but, you get something new, you don't tend to pick up the user guide and read it. You put it on the kitchen table and then you put it in the recycling box. Most people don't, start thumbing through those pages, and that's absolutely fine. So if they have picked up that manual, or opened the documentation page or whatever, there's a good chance they don't know how to do something and they might need a bit of help. So it's being aware of that as well when you're creating the documentation, because again, it goes back to the point of we're all human and sometimes we have frustrations, and documentation is an area that we often get funneled to when we have those frustrations.
Okay. I mean, I know what you mean. So some of the time, most of the times I've gone to documentation, whether that is like a manual, like you were saying, for a product, or, an online guide, is because, something is wrong. And especially if, you've got someone coming to your documentation, but they're not a newbie, if they've been doing it for multiple years and they're coming to your documentation, they're probably not going to be, like you said, that happy, because they're trying to figure something out, and especially if they're coming to your documentation that's for a new version of something that they already use, because that's the worst thing, is like when how to use language or a framework, for example, it's all going well, gets updated, and everything just starts breaking, then you're having to go to documentation. As an individual, it kind of makes you doubt yourself. It's just like, I knew how to do it before. Why don't I know now? And, they don't want to be going to the documentation, but they're, having to. And the last thing, people want to do is go to documentation and then it be a task in itself to navigate the documentation and figure out which documentation I actually need. So, keeping the documentation as simple, but also in depth as well, to be able to aid the person who's going through it. Because the last thing you want is somebody to go on the documentation and just get one line of code on there, but the reality is it requires 9 other lines of code that the writer is assuming that you should just know. Like, it's going to make the developer feel even worse about themselves.
Yeah, and you touched on an interesting point there, and developer, anybody who reads documentation. But you touched on an interesting point there about layering as well. It's about giving the end user the right information at the right time to the right depth. If you hit them with a 30-page, um, you know, scrolling central of online help when all they wanted to do was know what one checkbox does, then that can be equally frustrating. So it's about layering as well. I think great documentation.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, making it in such a way that you can access what you need to, and it's there, but you don't get overwhelmed by it. That you don't think, oh, I need these 10 pages, but in reality, you only need 2 of the pages, for the stage that you're at. So, having worked at JetBrains, what drew you to, JetBrains? What you like most about your job there?
I like lots of things about my job. What drew me was just the variation. I mean, that's something that well, no, it's a combination of two things. It was the variation in the role and getting to work with such a huge range of people. I mean, that's something you do in technical writing on a much smaller scale, because you often get to work across multiple developer teams. So you get to know lots of different people and you get to do a variety of content. But for the developer advocacy role, you get to do even more of that. You get to produce lots of different kinds of content, and you get to work with just fantastic people, both internally and externally. So I was drawn by that. I was also drawn by the variety variety in the workload. It's not technical writing is, in some ways, it can be quite samey. You are there to create release documentation, and I loved the job, but I get to do much more variety as a developer advocate, which is really exciting, because as well, there's a lot of autonomy. Developer needs are always changing, so you can align what you're doing with the developers that you're serving effectively. So yeah, it would be variation in the content you create, and just getting to work with brilliant developers both internally and externally. That's a huge plus for me.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, just going back to, when we was talking about, like the guides, the sort of stuff that JetBrains is working on, and what sort of future trend, especially something like, AI, Chat GPT, because I've been looking at that, and what it can do in terms of creating documentation, obviously
Mm.
generating code, and a bunch of other stuff as well. Like, how is JetBrains, but more just on a high level, how do you see that being integrated into the industry within these sort of more established companies?
It's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
It is.
So obviously we can see AI coming down the pipeline. Of course we can. Everybody can. We're about to release our AI assistant in our IDEs, so we'll be targeting kind of an augmented intelligence. Again, it's all about enhancing the developer productivity. It's what we've been doing for 20 years or 20 plus years. It's making them or empowering them to be awesome, right? That's kind of what it's all about. So it's that augmented intelligence, and really I see it as kind of a natural extension of all the work that we've done to date. It's going to be more, and it's going to keep evolving, right? I think sometimes we get a little bit, we get to a certain time or year and we think, right, we've really evolved and now we're really modern, and then next year it's all changed. It's all changed because this industry is so fast moving. This is just the beginning. We're going to see more and more of these offerings and changes in the developer community as a whole, you know as we go through the next weeks and months. I don't know how it will play out, but I'm looking forward to the journey, definitely.
Okay, so you just mentioned that JetBrains will be integrating some newer AI technologies and features to help the developer with suggestions, writing code, that sort of stuff. Can you talk about that a bit more specifically? What sort of form that's gonna come in? Because I know obviously Microsoft is doing their stuff, Google is doing their stuff. Plus, personally for me, I'm actually using, when it comes to a technical standpoint, Google less. When there's something I don't quite know and I would Google it, I'm using something like ChatGPT, because instead of me Googling it, opening 5 links, figuring out which post on one of those, Stack Overflow or whatever I'm opening, trying to figure it out, I'll put in ChatGPT, and it usually gives me a decent answer with examples, and then I can chat to him and be like, can you expand on this, or can you explain this a bit more? Like, what sort of stuff, if any, like that is JetBrains bringing in?
I would say look out for the EAP posts, because they will have landed, in fact, by the time this podcast goes out. So check those out, have a look, have a play, and as always, give us your feedback, because like I said, this is just the beginning. We're going to see more and more of this in the coming months from the developer community as a whole. But yes, we are releasing an AI assistant in our IDEs very, very soon.
I'm
So watch
excited
out
for
for
that
it.
then. Yeah, because to have something, obviously, again, I don't know exactly what form it's going to be taking in with the JetBrains stuff, but like just in general, to have something that you can have a bit more of a conversation around, and instead of just being like, here's a suggestion, if you can be like, that's not quite what I want, this is what I'm actually trying to achieve, to provide it some more context instead, because like you're saying, if you have a squiggle under piece of code, if you have like an error or a warning, and then they might have a solution, but the solution isn't quite what you want. But with a bit of context, probably the IDEs currently that JetBrains has probably could provide you with a solution. It's just giving you a pair of solution, a set of solutions that it thinks that you want, not really as tailored to what your specific scenario is. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure a lot of people have been listening to this episode and thinking, what? I would be interested in becoming a developer advocate, because yourself, you've done programming, you've got a computer science degree, you got that technical background, but then you were a technical writer for 15 plus years. So a bit unconventional to gain a computer science degree. Most people think he's going to become programmer, junior, mid, senior, maybe lead, and maybe some sort of manager. Your path has been slightly different. What advice would you give to someone that's listening and thinking, I want to become a developer advocate?
I would say just have a check in with what your passions are. If your passions are working with developers, creating content, maybe going to conferences, lots of communication, then maybe that is something that you'd like to explore. And you can try it out, right? There's lots of platforms out there that you can create content on. Some people like writing, some people like creating videos, some people are great at both, etc. You can try it out. You can put some content out there and you can see if you like it, and maybe you can attend some conferences and again see if you like it. Even take a venture into public speaking. That's something that we do quite a little bit of in developer advocacy. So I think there's lots of ways to kind of try it out and see if it is something that you'd like to do, if it's something that excites you. That would be my suggestion for how to find out if it is a career that would excite you, is to have a go at the light version.
Okay, I mean that's fair enough. Yeah, like dabble into it. It's like if you're becoming a programmer, it's one thing going from not being a programmer to getting a job full time, to watching some videos, going on Code Academy. If
Yeah.
it's a web developer, doing some HTML, CSS, JavaScript yourself. That will give you a good estimation of, is that even for you? Because there, I remember at uni, it's a bit silly when you actually think about it. But at uni, when I was in my first year, I did a computer games programming degree, and there was a guy there, and he dropped out after the first year. And the reason he dropped out was because he didn't like the programming side of it. And he thought, again, stupidly, considering it's got programming in the name, but he thought there wouldn't be as much programming because he saw games. He thought there'd be a bit more of a focus on just making games in general and less on, the coding side of things. And the thing is, he wanted to do a games design degree, but when we started, it was the 3,300 odd pound per year for these the course fees. After that, literally, after 1 year of me starting uni, it went up to the roughly what 10 grand it is now. And because he technically was gonna he was dropping out and wanted to start another degree, he would have had to go on the higher one. And he made the calculation that it's just not worth it for him anymore. If he had literally, because he clearly didn't do computer science at college, if he had just done a bit of work, a few hours really, or even a weekend of trying out some programming, he would have realized, no, not for me. It's not my jam. I'll go and do the games design degree from the start, instead of getting the debt, not having the degree, and not being able to do the other degree because it's too expensive now.
It's a huge ecosystem out there. That's what I would say. It's just because you have a computer science degree, or you've taught yourself programming, or you've come through a boot camp, or all of the other wonderful paths that you can take into development. There's lots of jobs out there that aren't pure programming, if that's not your thing. For many people, it is their thing and they love it. And that's fantastic. But if you don't, I would say the ecosystem is really, really big, and that's great as well. There's just so many jobs out there. All I would do is perhaps add a note of caution about when you have a full-time job and life and a limited number of hours in the day. I would be cautious of spreading yourself too thin, as you're trying out. Perhaps my suggestion of put a blog post out there or make a video, or because it can be quite hard to fit everything in without extra commitments. So just be aware of your time and your mental health if you're going to try out a different kind of career or side hustle.
Oh yeah, for sure. You've got to try these things out. Dabble into different areas, but like you said, Helen, understand there's a limited amount of time, especially when you do get older. You do have commitments. You got family. You've got other responsibilities. You've got work. And maybe other hobbies that you want to do as well. So
Exactly.
you've got to weigh everything up. So, that's all the, questions that I generally have. I've got a few more generic questions that I always ask at the end of my, podcast. And, actually one that I have missed before I go into the generic one. Do you have any personal, projects or passions related to tech that you would like to share that you're working on?
I wrote a book.
What's the book called for the listeners?
It's called Getting to Know IntelliJ Idea. I co-authored it with Trisha G, and that's available on both LeanPub if you want the ebook, and Amazon if you prefer a paper copy. So yeah,
was that done under JetBrains? Meaning, was that something as part of your job, or was that just because you enjoy it and you just did it as an extra thing?
The latter. Just
The
enjoyed
latter.
it. Did it. Yeah, did it on our own time. And it's still, just because it's done and it's published, we're still working on that. We're going to be updating it in the coming months, adding things as well, new UI amongst other changes. So yeah, it's that's been, well, I think 2 years of a project that was. So quite a long project. I think my only other passion really is learning, which again is probably something I should have said a lot earlier in the podcast about developer advocacy. You have to keep learning.
You do.
So, but that's no different to every other developer out there, I imagine. So, yeah, you have to keep learning, and I think if that's a passion and something that you care about, it makes the job a lot easier.
Oh yeah, I think it's one of those lifelong journeys, even outside of anything to do with development, and even jobs in general. Life is lifelong learning exercise, and the more you open yourself up to learning, the better your life can be, instead of boxing yourselves off. Because
Absolutely.
it's very easy for people to think, okay, I finished school, I finished college, or I finished uni if they go that high in terms of their education. I'll finish with education now. But in reality, the education that's probably going to enhance your life actually occurs outside of that and after that. That concludes this week's episode of FireDEV. We had Helen Scott with us on the podcast. Thank you, Helen, and thank you for all the listeners out there. And I'll see you in next week's episode. Bye bye.